Gog and Magog are names that appear in ancient religious texts, notably the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran, and over centuries they have become synonymous with apocalyptic chaos and mysterious enemies at the world's end. In the Bible, Gog is introduced as a leader from the land of Magog, who will invade Israel in the prophecy of Ezekiel. By the time of the New Testament, Jewish and Christian traditions were referring to Gog and Magog together as forces of evil to be defeated at the end of days. In Jewish eschatology, Gog and Magog came to represent the final enemies whom the Messiah will overcome. In Christian apocalyptic thought, they are portrayed as allies of Satan in a last great battle against God. The Qur'an also speaks of these entities, in Arabic, Ya'juj and Ma'juj, as wild, lawless tribes that were once contained behind a great barrier and will be released as a sign of the end times. Over time, the legend of Gog and Magog expanded far beyond Scripture, inspiring medieval legends about Alexander the Great building a wall to imprison them, and fueling many conspiracy theories and interpretations linking them to historical nations or future events. The earliest references to Magog occur in the Hebrew Bible's genealogies. In the book of Genesis, Magog is listed as a son of Japheth, one of Noah's sons, implying Magog was the ancestor of a nation of the far north. Later, the book of Ezekiel contains the most famous Gog prophecy. Ezekiel, a prophet among the Jewish exiles in Babylon, delivers an oracle in which Gog of the land of Magog is a great enemy who will invade the land of Israel in the future. Gog is described as a prince of Meshech and Tubal, likely referring to regions in Anatolia, Asia Minor, and he assembles a vast horde from many nations to attack Israel. The biblical text dramatically lists Gog's allies. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with you, Gomer with all its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops. These names correspond to real peoples at the fringes of the ancient world. For example, Meshech and Tubal were kingdoms in what is now Turkey, Persia to Israel's east, Iran, Cush to the south, Nubia or Ethiopia, Put to the southwest, Libya. Gomer refers to the Cimmerians north of the Black Sea, and Togarmah likely an Anatolian people. By invoking this diverse coalition from the far north and other distant regions, the prophecy paints Gog's army as a multinational menace encircling Israel. Biblical scholars note that the remoteness and fearsome reputation of these peoples made them ideal symbols of an archetypal enemy rising against God's people. According to Ezekiel's prophecy, chapters 38 to 39, this terrifying invasion will happen after Israel has been restored from exile and is living securely in its land. Gog will march his forces against the mountains of Israel, advancing like a cloud covering the earth, to plunder the prosperous land. The confrontation described is cataclysmic. God himself intervenes to defend Israel. The text says that God will send a great earthquake, torrential rain, hailstones, fire, and sulfur upon Gog's troops, sowing panic and destruction among them. In the end, Gog and his entire horde are utterly destroyed by divine action. Their bodies cover the ground and will be given a mass burial in a place to be named Hamon-Gog, meaning hordes of Gog, so that the land may be cleansed. Through this victory, the greatness and holiness of God is demonstrated to all nations, and Israel's relationship with its God is restored. After Gog's defeat, Ezekiel's prophecy transitions into visions of a new ideal temple and a time of peace, indicating that Gog's war precedes an era of divine harmony on earth. It is not entirely clear from the text whether Ezekiel intended this Gog and Magog war to be the final end-of-days conflict or simply a climactic future deliverance for Israel. The Hebrew phrase used, Acharit Hayamim, can mean latter days or future years, not necessarily the literal end of the world. Many later interpreters, however, took Ezekiel's prophecy as a vision of the apocalyptic end times. The vivid and cryptic nature of the Gog oracle, with its mysterious names and grand scale of destruction, invited much speculation. Some modern scholars have suggested the prophecy may have drawn on historical events known to Ezekiel, such as invasions by Scythian tribes around the 7th century BCE, as a model for this ultimate enemy horde. Others see influence from earlier mythic battles of good versus evil, for instance, chaos monsters from Mesopotamian lore being repurposed into an end-times scenario. Whatever its origins, Ezekiel's portrayal of Gog from Magog established the template. Gog symbolized a foreign invader of almost supernaturally vast power, fated to be vanquished by God. This theme of a final, God-defeated enemy would echo through later Jewish and Christian apocalyptic writings. After the time of the Hebrew Bible, Jewish thought continued to develop the concept of a climactic war involving Gog and Magog. In the centuries just before the Common Era, as Jewish communities faced imperial domination, first under Greeks, then Romans, apocalyptic literature flourished and often referenced Gog and Magog. Notably, Jewish writers began to pair the two names and speak of Gog and Magog together, rather than Gog of Magog. For example, the Sibylline Oracles, a collection of Jewish prophetic verses from around the 2nd century BCE, rewrite Ezekiel's prophecy by mentioning Gog and Magog as joint leaders of an alliance of nations. These oracles place Gog and Magog in some exotic locale. One manuscript even situates them among the nations by the Ethiopian rivers, at the world's edge. Such details are fanciful, but they indicate how Jews of the intertestamental period envisioned Gog and Magog as a collective symbol of the hostile pagan nations. Another text of that era, the Book of Jubilees, circa 2nd century BCE, mentions Magog as a descendant of Noah and even lists territories for Gog and Magog, further cementing their roles as nations destined for future conflict. By the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1st century BCE, the term Gog and Magog is found in at least one fragment, suggesting that the pairing was well known in Jewish apocalyptic expectations. During and after the traumatic Roman conquest of Judea, 70 CE, and the failed Bar Kokhba revolt, 135 CE, Jewish hopes for deliverance increasingly took on a supernatural, future-oriented character. The idea emerged that there would be a great war of Gog and Magog as a prelude to the Messianic age. In later rabbinic legends, the sequence was outlined like this: a messianic figure from the tribe of Joseph, called Messiah ben Joseph, will arise to fight the wars of Israel and will confront the forces of Gog and Magog, defeating them to pave the way for the ultimate Messiah from David's line. After this victory over Gog and Magog, the final redemption would unfold, including the resurrection of the dead and the kingdom of God. This two-Messiah scenario appears in some Midrashic and Talmudic discussions, highlighting how central the Gog-Magog war had become in Jewish end-time scenarios by the early Middle Ages. Rabbinic writings generally treated Gog and Magog as metaphorical or code names for Israel's future enemies, without pinpointing a specific ethnic group. The Talmud and Midrash often speak of Gog-u-Magog, Gog and Magog, as a generic foreign foe who will attack at the end of days, only to be destroyed by divine intervention. In one Talmudic passage, the question is posed: will Gog and Magog come against Israel? The answer given is that they will indeed come in the final war, but God will rain fire and brimstone on them, echoing Ezekiel's imagery, and they will fall upon the mountains of Israel. The rabbis did not identify Gog and Magog with any contemporary nation, generally saying the invasion would come from the distant north. However, as time went on, some Jewish commentators did speculate. The famous medieval French rabbi Rashi, 1040 to 1010, suggested that Magog might allude to Christendom. He identified the armies of Gog and Magog as including the Christian nations of Europe, whom he expected would one day attack Israel alongside other allies. Rashi wrote that God would then thwart their plans and save the Jewish people. This shows how, by the Crusades era, Jews living in Christian-dominated lands began to view the oppressive Christian powers as potential Gog and Magog figures. Jewish mystics and commentators continued to discuss Gog and Magog in esoteric ways. Some linked Gog and Magog with the ancient enemy of Israel, Amalek, seeing them as a spiritual inheritor of that archetype of evil. For instance, Rabbi Zadok HaKohen of Lublin, 19th century, In his work, Tzaddik draws a parallel that Gog and Magog is the seed of Amalek, meaning the final war is essentially a continuation of the biblical battle against Amalek, a symbol of evil opposing God's people. Such interpretations reinforce the idea that Gog and Magog represent ultimate evil that must be vanquished before the world can be perfected. To this day, in Jewish colloquial use, the phrase Milhemet Gog and Magog, War of Gog and Magog, can refer broadly to a cataclysmic or final war. The notion persists in Jewish prayer and commentary that there will be a great tumultuous conflict, literal or figurative, before the dawn of the Messianic era, and Gog and Magog remain the metaphorical labels for the enemies in that final drama. Within Christianity, Gog and Magog take on new life in the apocalyptic visions of the New Testament. The book of Revelation, written near the end of the 1st century CE, picks up the names Gog and Magog and projects them into an end-of-time scenario. In Revelation chapter 20, after the defeat of earthly tyrannies and a millennium, a 1,000-year reign of Christ and peace, it is foretold that Satan will be released from his prison and will go out to deceive the nations in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, and to gather them for battle. In number, these nations are said to be like the sand on the seashore. They march across the earth and surround the camp of God's people and the city he loves, understood as Jerusalem, in one final assault. But the rebellion is swiftly crushed. Fire rains down from heaven and devours Gog and Magog and all the hordes of Satan. Subsequently, Satan himself is cast into the lake of fire, and the last judgment commences. Thus, in the Christian Bible's final book, Gog and Magog represent the collective evil forces of the world, aligned with Satan, that will attack the faithful at the very end of history, only to be annihilated by God's direct intervention. Revelation's use of Gog and Magog is somewhat symbolic. Unlike Ezekiel, which treats Gog as an individual leader, Revelation uses the pair as metaphorical names for nations at the 4 corners of the earth. Essentially, they stand for all the ungodly nations of the world. Early Christian writers understood this as a depiction of a final global onslaught against the church or against God's people to occur just before the final judgment. This imagery reinforced the idea that even after a period of Christ's peaceful reign, evil would make one last attempt, but it would be divinely crushed. Because Revelation explicitly invokes Gog and Magog, the association of those names with the apocalypse became firmly embedded in Christian thought. In the centuries after, Christian exegetes tried to reconcile Ezekiel's prophecy with Revelation's prophecy. There was debate about whether the Gog and Magog war in Ezekiel 38 to 39 was the same event as the one described in Revelation 20, or a different battle. Some early church fathers, like Augustine, concluded that they were essentially the same, and that Ezekiel's prophecy was a figurative foretelling of the final attack of Satan's forces mentioned in Revelation. Others entertained that Ezekiel might be referring to a separate earlier conflict, since Ezekiel's narrative seems to set it before a peaceful era on earth, which could correspond to a millennial kingdom. This is a nuanced theological question. However, in popular Christian culture, the two have often been blended, and Gog and Magog simply became synonymous with the ultimate enemies of God to appear at doomsday. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christian commentators and chroniclers frequently speculated about the identity of Gog and Magog in their contemporary world. As waves of invaders and nomadic hordes appeared in Europe and the Near East, many were quick to label these threatening outsiders as Gog and Magog. For instance, in the 5th century, as the Huns descended upon Europe, some Christian writers identified the Huns with the peoples of Gog and Magog. Saint Jerome, writing in the early 5th century, located Magog's land beyond the Caucasus near the Caspian Sea, and thought the invading Huns fit that geography. Later, during the early medieval period, the newly arrived Magyars, Hungarians, in Europe, were at one point equated with Gog and Magog as well. Essentially, any terrifying barbarian horde from the northeast could be slotted into the Gog and Magog role. One persistent strand of Christian legend even cast Muslims as Gog and Magog. During the Crusades and other conflicts with Islamic powers, European Christians sometimes referred to their Muslim adversaries in apocalyptic terms. In one medieval chronicle, the entire Muslim world led by Muhammad was identified with Magog, and later Saracen, Muslim leaders like Saladin were also linked to these prophecies. In the Crusade-era mentality, Christians saw themselves as engaged in what could be the final battles between good and evil, so drawing on Gog Magog imagery for the Muslim armies was a way to fit current events into biblical prophecy. Similarly, other European writers speculated that the 10 lost tribes of Israel, a legendary lost population, might resurface as Gog and Magog, or conversely that Gog and Magog were pagan nations holding those lost tribes captive. The names became a flexible cipher for dreaded other. Below is a summary of various identifications of Gog and Magog made throughout history by different interpreters. Scythians. The first-century Jewish historian Josephus wrote that Magog's people were the Scythians, a term classical authors used for the wild nomadic tribes beyond the Black Sea. This is one of the earliest attempts to historicize Magog's identity. Huns. By the 5th to 6th centuries AD, some Christian commentators, and at least one Syriac Christian text, labeled the Hun invaders from Central Asia as Gog and Magog. Turkish and Mongolic nomads. In later medieval times, waves of steppe invaders like the Magyars, 10th century, and the Mongols, 13th century, were commonly tied to the Gog-Magog legend. As the Mongol hordes under Genghis Khan and his successors ravaged lands from Asia to the Middle East, both Europeans and Middle Easterners saw them as a real-life embodiment of Gog and Magog, unthinkably fierce tribes from the ends of the earth. Vikings. Some medieval writers even identified the seafaring Vikings, Norsemen who raided Europe in the 8th to 10th centuries, with Gog and Magog, due to their ferocity and the fear they inspired. Khazars. In a curious twist, some early Arabic and Jewish sources associated Gog and Magog with the Khazars, a Central Asian people who had converted to Judaism. The geographer Yakut, 13th century, wrote that some say they belong to the Khazars, who are all Jews, hinting at a legend that the Khazar realm might be where Yajuj and Majuj originate. Muslims, Saracens. As mentioned, during the Crusades era, European Christians sometimes viewed the Islamic armies as the forces of Gog and Magog, especially when rumors circulated of coming battles in the Holy Land. 10 lost tribes. In both Jewish and Christian apocalyptic lore, Gog and Magog were occasionally linked to the lost tribes of Israel, either as adversaries or as encompassing those lost tribes. This was more metaphorical, symbolizing a long-anticipated return and conflict. The wide range of these identifications shows how Gog and Magog became a kind of universal cipher for distant, threatening peoples in the medieval imagination. As each new barbarian menace appeared on the scene, people asked, "Are these Gog and Magog?" The terminology gave theological meaning to historical fears, casting contemporary events as part of a divine end-times plan. Christian literature also produced legends and prophecies around Gog and Magog beyond straightforward biblical commentary. In various apocalyptic prophecies of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, Gog and Magog sometimes feature as part of the drama of the Antichrist. Medieval legends spoke of a coming last emperor, or a great Christian king, who in the final days would defeat the forces of Gog and Magog and vanquish the Antichrist, ushering in a period of peace before the end of the world. In some versions, Gog and Magog were depicted as serving in the Antichrist's army, or as precursors to his rise. The influential 12th century Christian visionary Joachim of Fiore offered a unique interpretation. He believed Gog himself was a code name for the final Antichrist. Joachim theorized that there would be an earlier Antichrist who would be defeated, then a millennium of peace, and only after that would the ultimate adversary, Gog, appear to bring about the Last Judgment. Though not all agreed with Joachim, this indicates how deeply enmeshed Gog and Magog were in Christian end-times speculation. By the end of the medieval period, the names Gog and Magog had become ingrained in Christian lore not only as biblical references, but as figures in folklore and popular legend. as we will see in later chapters. But in a theological sense, Christians across eras shared the expectation that Gog and Magog represents the final coalition of evil in the world, a foe that only God, or God's Messiah, Christ, can defeat. Whether that foe was imagined as literal nations at the world's edges or as spiritual forces behind worldly powers, the consistent theme was their catastrophic defeat, signaling God's ultimate victory over evil. One of the most fascinating developments in the Gog and Magog saga is their connection to Alexander the Great. Outside of the biblical canon, a rich body of legend grew up that intertwined the fate of Gog and Magog with the exploits of Alexander, the famed Macedonian conqueror. This culminated in the medieval story of Alexander's Gate, a mythical barrier supposedly built by Alexander to lock away Gog and Magog until the end of time. This legend was remarkably widespread, appearing in Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions in various forms, and it helped explain just why Gog and Magog had not yet overwhelmed the world. The roots of the tale can be traced to around the 1st century CE and shortly thereafter. The Jewish historian Josephus mentions that Alexander the Great campaigned in regions near the Caucasus and supposedly built iron gates in the Caucasus Mountains. Josephus himself equated the people of Magog in Genesis with the Scythians, and he recounted a story of the Alans, a Scythian tribe, being granted passage through a gate by a local king to raid the lands beyond. By Josephus's time, Alexander was already a larger-than-life folk hero for many cultures. The notion of Alexander as a world explorer who might have encountered distant savage tribes was plausible to the imagination of the era. The fully developed legend of Alexander's Gate appears in a Syriac work known as the Alexander Romance, a legendary biography of Alexander that accreted many fantastical tales, and more explicitly in an apocalyptic text called the Pseudo-Methodius in the 7th century. In these versions, Alexander, during his conquests in the East, comes upon the wild nations of Gog and Magog, sometimes identified with the Huns or other nomads. Seeing the chaos they wreak, Alexander prays to God, and God causes 2 mountains, often called the Breasts of the North, to move together, narrowing a pass. Alexander then constructs a mighty gate of iron or bronze in the gap between these mountains. He seals in 22 different wicked nations behind this barrier, among them Gog and Magog. The texts sometimes call them by variant names like Goth and Magoth. The wall is fortified with quick-setting bronze and covered with an oily substance to make it slick. According to the legend, Alexander inscribes on the gate a prophecy that the imprisoned hordes will break free at the end of the world when God permits it. This story resonated strongly. To people of late antiquity and the early medieval period, it provided a neat explanation for the location of Gog and Magog. They weren't rampaging now because Alexander had heroically locked them up beyond a gate. It also added a thrilling doomsday scenario. One day that gate would break open, and the world would face an unprecedented onslaught. The Syriac legend of Alexander, circa 7th century, is one of the earliest texts that explicitly links the gates of Alexander with the apocalyptic release of Gog and Magog, and this idea was soon incorporated into various languages and literatures. The story was translated and retold in Greek, Latin, Armenian, Persian, Ethiopic, and Arabic, among others. In Christian Europe, the Alexander Gog-Magog legend became well known. Maps of the medieval world, Mappae Mundi, often showed Alexander's Gate at the edge of Asia, with the monstrous nations of Gog and Magog confined behind it. For example, the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, circa 1300, depicts Gog and Magog in the far northeast, penned in by mountains. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, a Spanish world map, illustrates a scene of a king leading a procession labeled as the people of Gog and Magog behind a great wall, with Alexander shown nearby sealing them in. Medieval readers truly believed that somewhere in the distant north or east there was a real barrier, often called the Caspian Gates, that kept those terrible nations at bay. Detail from the Catalan Atlas, 1375, showing the land of Gog-i-Magog enclosed at the world's edge. In this medieval European map, Gog and Magog's king, on horseback left, leads a procession of his people trapped behind a gated mountain pass. Above them, an inscription and figures, Alexander the Great and others, depict the legendary Alexander's Gate, built to imprison Gog and Magog until the end of time. Such maps illustrate how firmly the Alexander legend and the Gog Magog prophecy were intertwined in the medieval imagination. Interestingly, as geographical knowledge expanded, different sites were proposed for Alexander's miraculous gate. Early on, many thought the Caucasus Mountains near the Caspian Sea were the location. There is indeed an ancient fortified pass at Derbent on the Caspian shore, with long walls. The legend often became associated with that. Later travelers who reached Central Asia heard of other barriers. Some accounts conflated Alexander's wall with the Great Wall of China. Muslim writers like Abu al-Fida, 14th century, noted that some believed the Great Wall was the structure built to contain Gog and Magog. This shows how the legend adapted to new information. As the Mongol Empire's conquests opened up Asian geography to the west, people reinterpreted the old stories. In the Islamic world, as we will detail in the next chapter, the Quran includes a story of a great ruler, referred to as Dhul-Qarnayn, often identified with Alexander or Cyrus, who builds a wall to trap Ya'juj and Ma'juj. This is essentially the same legend absorbed into Islamic tradition. Thus, both Christian and Muslim civilizations carried forward the tale of Gog and Magog imprisoned behind a mighty wall, awaiting their end-time release. The legend also inspired actual expeditions. A famous episode occurred in the year 842 AD under the Abbasid Caliph al-Wathiq. The caliph dreamt that the wall of Gog and Magog had breached. Alarmed, he sent an emissary, Salam the interpreter, with a caravan to journey to the far north and verify the wall's condition. Salam's travelogue, whether fact or fiction, survives. He supposedly traveled through dangerous lands and eventually reached a towering wall between mountains, made of iron bricks and molten brass, with a massive iron gate locked and bolted, exactly as legend described. Salam reported back that the gate was intact. The caliph was relieved. It meant Ya'juj and Ma'juj were still safely locked away. This story, recorded by Arab historians, reveals how tangible and real the Alexander's Gate myth was to medieval people. They treated it almost like a geopolitical fact you could go verify on the ground. Historians today suspect Salam may have reached the Derbent fortifications or a similar site and embellished details to fit the legend. Whether through text or maps or travelers' tales, the Alexander Gog Magog connection remained a staple of storytelling right into the Renaissance. It was a compelling fusion of heroic legend with biblical prophecy, the greatest conqueror of antiquity containing the forces of the apocalypse. The dramatic appeal is obvious, a mighty gate holding back chaos until one day the lock will fail. This legend provided the narrative framework in which later generations understood Gog and Magog's absence from the world. If they're not rampaging now, it's because a great king once caged them, but someday they will return. In the Islamic world, Gog and Magog are known as Ya'juj and Ma'juj, sometimes spelled Ya'juj wa Ma'juj, and they occupy an important place in Islamic eschatology and legend. The Quran and Hadith, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, weave the story of Ya'juj and Ma'juj in a way that parallels some of the Judeo-Christian traditions, but also offers unique elements. In the Quran, Gog and Magog are explicitly mentioned in two places. Surah Al-Kahf, 1883-98, tells the story of a great righteous ruler called Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, who many Muslim scholars equate with Alexander the Great, though others suggest it could be Cyrus or another figure. Dhul-Qarnayn travels to the ends of the earth and comes upon a people who plead for his help against the ravages of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, who cause great mischief in the land. They ask him to erect a barrier between them and Ya'juj-Ma'juj. Dhul-Qarnayn agrees, and ingeniously builds a massive wall or dam out of iron and molten copper between two mountains, such that Gog and Magog cannot scale or penetrate it. Once the barrier is complete, Dhul-Qarnayn declares that it will hold until the appointed time of God's promise, but one day God will level it to the ground, implying that the release of Gog and Magog will be a sign that the end of the world is near. This Quranic passage aligns closely with the Alexander's Gate legends. It provides scriptural authority in Islam for the idea that Gog and Magog are a real tribe, or tribes, trapped behind a wall until doomsday. Another mention, Surah Al-Anbiya, 2196, is brief but dramatic. It says that a time will come when Ya'juj and Ma'juj are let loose upon the world, swarming from every elevated place, indicating a massive, overwhelming invasion as one of the final signs before the Day of Judgment. In Islamic theology, the emergence of Ya'juj and Ma'juj is indeed listed among the major signs of the hour, the end times. Their appearance is often said to occur after the return of Prophet Jesus, Isa, who in Islamic belief will come back to defeat the false Messiah, Antichrist figure called Dajjal. Only then, in the final period of earthly history, will Gog and Magog break free. Islamic hadiths provide more colorful details about Ya'juj and Ma'juj. The Prophet Muhammad is reported to have described them in vivid terms. In one authentic hadith from Sahih Muslim, it is said that Allah will reveal to Jesus, "I have brought forth from among my servants such people against whom none will be able to fight. So take my servants safely to the mountain. Then Gog and Magog will swarm down from every slope, and the first of them will drink the entire Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, dry. And when the last of them passes, they'll remark, 'There used to be water here once.'" The hadith continues that the horde will then wreak havoc, and the beleaguered believers with Jesus will pray to God for aid. God will then send a sort of pestilence, in some narrations worms or insects, that will attack the necks of Gog and Magog, killing them all in one night, as if one single soul. The next morning, the earth will be filled with their corpses, and God will send birds to carry off their bodies and rain to wash the land. Thus, in Islamic tradition, Gog and Magog's end comes by an act of God after they have devastated the world, freeing humanity from their scourge. Islamic lore even describes what Gog and Magog look like, though these descriptions are more folkloric. Some sources, like the medieval scholar Al-Qazwini's accounts of wonders, claim Ya'juj and Ma'juj are humanoid but physically bizarre, extremely numerous, short in stature, with claws instead of nails, and with large hairy ears that they use as bedding and blankets. They are depicted as savage, almost subhuman creatures who consume everything in their path, even practicing cannibalism, according to some legends. These imaginative details are not found in the Quran itself, but in later stories and commentaries, which aim to convey just how otherworldly and fearsome these beings are. The location of the wall of Dhul-Qarnayn became a subject of much scholarly and popular debate in the Islamic world as well. Early Muslim commentators like Ibn Kathir reiterated that Ya'juj and Ma'juj were two groups of Turks, i.e., Turkic peoples, descendants of Japheth, the son of Noah, situating them in the general Central Asia/Eurasian steppe region. Many Muslim geographers identified the legendary barrier with places in the Caucasus. One popular candidate was the Darial Pass, also known as the Caucasian Gates, near the modern Russia-Georgia border, which had an ancient iron gate. Another was the city of Derbent on the Caspian Sea, in modern Dagestan, Russia, which has long walls spanning between the sea and the Caucasus Mountains. These were even called Alexander's Wall by local tradition. As in Christendom, some Muslim writers later speculated the Great Wall of China could be Dhul-Qarnayn's wall, but most stuck to locations in the Caucasus or Central Asia. Notably, Islamic chronicles interpreted real historical events through the lens of the Ya'juj-Ma'juj prophecies. When the Mongols, led by Genghis Khan and later his descendants, invaded the Islamic lands in the 13th century, causing unprecedented destruction, like the sack of Baghdad in 1258, many Muslims at the time truly believed Gog and Magog had been unleashed. The Mongols fit the bill. They came from the mysterious far reaches of the earth, were not Muslim, seemed impossibly numerous and cruel, and swept through civilized lands with devastating speed. The historian Ibn al-Nafis wrote, that the Abbasid Caliphate's orthodox view was that the Mongol invaders are Gog and Magog, fulfilling the ancient prophecy. This shows the continuity of the narrative. Almost 1,600 years after Ezekiel, people were still identifying contemporary barbarians with Gog and Magog, now framed in Islamic terms. In Islamic eschatology, after Gog and Magog are destroyed by God, the last days proceed with other signs, such as the rising of the sun from the west, the appearance of a gentle wind that takes the souls of the faithful, etc., leading up to the day of resurrection. Thus, Ya'juj and Ma'juj are one of the final ordeals of humanity. The Qur'anic and Hadith accounts of them have ensured that Muslims around the world, to this day, are familiar with the gist of their story. Wild tribes once contained by an ancient king's wall, whose eventual breakout will signal the world's final chapter. Beyond formal religious texts and commentaries, Gog and Magog also found their way into various folk legends, mythology, and even local traditions, sometimes in surprising forms. Two of the most famous examples come from the West: the legends of Gog and Magog in Britain, and the incorporation of Gog and Magog into medieval European lore as literal giants. In Britain, there emerged a myth of giants named Gog Magog, or Goemagot, and Coronius in the context of the nation's legendary founding. According to the 12th century chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth, when the Trojan hero Brutus, legendary forefather of the Britons, arrived on the island of Albion, he encountered a race of giants. The greatest of these was Gog Magog, a ferocious giant chieftain of Cornwall. Geoffrey's tale relates that one of Brutus's companions, Coronius, wrestled Gog Magog and hurled him off a cliff to his death, thus securing the land for Brutus and the Trojans. Geoffrey likely borrowed the name Gog Magog from the biblical Gog/Magog, but in this context it had nothing to do with apocalyptic prophecy. It was simply a giant's name in an origin myth for Britain. Over time, British folklore split the name Gog Magog into two. Later storytellers, and perhaps some confusion in manuscripts, started talking about two giants, one named Gog and one named Magog, who were said to have been the last survivors of the native giants defeated by Brutus. These giant brothers were supposedly chained and brought to London to serve as guardians, or in some versions porters, at the royal palace. This legend evolved such that Gog and Magog became symbolic protectors of London. By the medieval period, carved effigies of two giants named Gog and Magog were indeed present in London's Guildhall and figured in ceremonial parades. Starting as early as the reign of Henry V, 15th century, the City of London had giant figures called Gog and Magog, carried in the annual Lord Mayor's show procession. These enormous wooden statues were seen as emblems of the city's legendary heritage. The original effigies were destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666, but new ones replaced them in 1708. Those, in turn, were destroyed in World War II during the Blitz, 1940, and yet again they were recreated in 1953, a testament to how deeply the tradition is cherished. To this day, statues of Gog and Magog, in gilded form, stand in London's Guildhall, and replicas lead the Lord Mayor's parade each year. They have become folk figures, no longer ominous but rather benevolent giants, guardians of the city. A 19th century engraving of the colossal wooden figures Gog and Magog in the Guildhall, London. These giants have been a fixture of London folklore for centuries. According to legend, they represent defeated giants spared by Britain's mythical founder Brutus and made to stand guard in service of the city. Effigies of Gog and Magog have been carried in London processions since at least the medieval period. Though the originals were destroyed by fire and war, they were always rebuilt, showing the enduring charm of this local legend. It's fascinating that a pair of fearsome end-of-world monsters were reinvented as patron giants of a city. This transformation in folklore stripped Gog and Magog of their biblical context entirely. In the British context, most people telling the tale likely didn't associate these giants with the apocalyptic Gog and Magog at all. The names had taken on a life of their own. In fact, the medieval British texts that mention them often treat Gog Magog as a single giant, sometimes spelling it as Gomagot, and the introduction of two separate names came later through popular retellings. One could say the biblical names were borrowed to lend an air of antiquity and gravity to Britain's national myth, much like other classical and biblical references in Geoffrey's pseudo-history. Elsewhere in Europe, Gog and Magog occasionally cropped up in cultural references. For example, in medieval French Romance literature or chansons de geste, the names might be used as shorthand for distant lands or monstrous peoples. They appear on maps, as noted, and even into the Renaissance, writers like François Rabelais made erudite jokes referencing Gog and Magog. Rabelais in Gargantua and Pantagruel has a giant list his lineage from Gog and Magog. These instances show that educated audiences were aware of Gog and Magog both as biblical entities and as generic symbols of ancient giant-like peoples. Another noteworthy usage is the term Caspian Gates, or Gates of Gog and Magog, which filtered into travelogues. When European travelers in the Mongol era, like Marco Polo or John Mandeville, ventured east, they sometimes used the Gog-Magog legend to interpret what they heard. Polo, for instance, writes about a region in the far north of Asia where wild tribes were contained by a great mountain barrier, an echo of the Alexander story. Friar John Carpini, one of the first Western envoys to the Mongols, wrote in 1245 that the Mongols told him Gog and Magog were peoples living north of the Great Wall. These early travel accounts spread to Europe and kept the legends alive outside purely religious contexts. In the Middle East and Central Asia, local legends also identified certain historic walls or ruins with the Wall of Gog and Magog. In northeastern Iran and Central Asia, various fortifications built by Persian kings or others were at times called Sedi Iskander, Alexander's rampart. The Great Wall of Gorgan in Iran, an ancient Sasanian defense line, for example, got linked with Alexander in local lore, even though it predates Islam. Similarly, in the Caucasus, folk tales about iron gates often harkened back to the Qur'anic story. Today, one can visit Derbent in Dagestan, where a fortress wall runs between the mountains and sea. Local guides still mention its association with Dhul-Qarnayn's legend. Thus, Gog and Magog pervaded folklore, as giants, as mysterious nations, as far-off lands, and as labels on maps. The elasticity of the names is striking. For some, they remained frightening portents of doom. For others, they became almost playful mythic characters like London's friendly giants. In any case, the fact that we find Gog and Magog in contexts ranging from religious prophecy to local festival puppets shows their unique footprint on cultural history. Few apocalyptic symbols have been as widely adopted and adapted. Even in the modern era, long after the age of biblical prophecy and medieval legend, the mystique of Gog and Magog persists. They continue to be referenced in religious discourse about the end times, and at times have been swept into the realm of conspiracy theories and speculative geopolitics. In contemporary usage, Gog and Magog often serve as allegorical code names for real nations or coalitions thought to pose an existential threat, especially in the context of apocalyptic or prophetic belief systems. In Christian evangelical circles, particularly those focused on biblical prophecy, like certain fundamentalist and dispensationalist interpretations, Gog and Magog are frequently discussed with an eye on current international affairs. A popular view, stemming largely from readings of Ezekiel 38 to 39, is that Gog and Magog represent a specific future aggressor against the modern state of Israel. Many 20th century prophecy teachers identified Magog with the Soviet Union, Russia, partly because Ezekiel describes Gog coming from the far north and leading a vast alliance including Persia, Iran, Kush, interpreted as regions of Africa, and others. During the Cold War, it became almost an article of faith in some quarters that Gog equals Russia, and that a great Russian-led invasion of Israel was looming as a prelude to Armageddon. In the 1970s and 80s, best-selling authors like Hal Lindsey popularized this idea, suggesting that the USSR's interests in the Middle East fit Ezekiel's prophecy. Even U.S. President Ronald Reagan reportedly mused on the possibility that Gog and Magog could be at work in contemporary events, apparently considering that the Bible foretold a showdown with Russia. This line of interpretation still survives today, with modifications. For instance, after the Soviet collapse, some identify Gog with Russia's leadership or with another northern power. The common theme is trying to correlate biblical prophecy with modern nations, Russia, Iran, and others in an end times coalition. A rather astonishing modern reference occurred in early 2003 in the lead-up to the Iraq War. George W. Bush, then President of the United States, known for his evangelical Christian faith, spoke with French President Jacques Chirac, seeking support for the war. In that conversation, Bush invoked Gog and Magog explicitly. He told Chirac that Gog and Magog are at work in the Middle East, and that biblical prophecies are being fulfilled in the confrontation with Saddam Hussein. Chirac, unfamiliar with those biblical names, was baffled. He had to ask advisors to explain what Bush meant. This incident, later reported by Chirac and journalists, revealed that Bush's worldview imbued the geopolitical situation with apocalyptic significance. He apparently saw the Iraq conflict in terms of a battle against agents of satanic evil as foretold in Scripture. The fact that a modern war was justified, in part, using Gog and Magog imagery shows how powerfully these ancient symbols can still resonate and be invoked, rightly or wrongly, in global affairs. On the fringes of both Christian and Islamic thought, conspiracy theories have arisen around Gog and Magog. These often identify Gog Magog with particular ethnic or political groups in a manner not endorsed by mainstream theologians. For example, a theory that circulated in some circles, both in the West and the Muslim world, is that Magog refers to Magogites, who are the descendants of ancient Khazars, and thus that Gog and Magog are code for certain Jewish populations. In one variant of this theory, European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, are alleged to be the progeny of the Khazars, and therefore labeled as Gog and Magog, a conspiratorial and anti-Semitic claim with no basis in actual scripture. It essentially twists the medieval association of Khazars with Magog into a modern attack on Jews. This idea was popularized by a handful of 20th century writers and has been refuted by historians. The genetics and history of Ashkenazi Jews do not point simply to Khazar ancestry, and in any case the Bible never equates Magog with Jews. Nonetheless, the notion finds echoes on the internet and in extremist literature, where Gog and Magog become code for a supposed hidden cabal or malevolent force. In a similar vein, some Islamic conspiracy theorists have posited that Gog and Magog are actually the Western powers, Europe and America, or even specific nations like Britain or the United States, who they claim are behind global chaos. One influential contemporary Muslim thinker, for instance, has argued that Ya'juj and Ma'juj symbolize the modern secular Western civilization that has spread around the globe, an interpretation far outside classical commentary, essentially casting today's geopolitical power dynamics as fulfillment of prophecy. These theories often cite the technological dominance and worldwide influence of the West as evidence that Gog and Magog have already been unleashed in the form of Western nations controlling world affairs. Such ideas remain fringe and are usually rejected by Orthodox Islamic scholars, but they have gained some traction among those who blend religious prophecy with political grievances. Another modern identification, especially in evangelical Christian prophecy circles, ties Gog and Magog to a future alliance possibly involving Russia, Iran, Turkey, and other nations against Israel. This is drawn from a close reading of Ezekiel's list of Gog's allies: Persia equals Iran, Meshech and Tubal equals regions sometimes linked by interpreters to parts of Turkey, etc. Books, films, and sermons abound, predicting a coming war of Gog and Magog in the Middle East. Some believe this war is imminent and separate from the later Battle of Armageddon, suggesting two Gog-Magog confrontations, one premillennial, one postmillennial, as per Revelation. Others see Ezekiel and Revelation as describing the same ultimate conflict. Regardless, it remains a hot topic in prophecy seminars. Notably, when dramatic events occur, for example, international conflicts involving Israel or its northern neighbors, there's often a spike in interest. Is this Gog moving? For instance, The Russian military involvement in the Syria conflict, 2015 onwards, led some prophecy commentators to say Gog is on the move, since Syria borders Israel. These interpretations are speculative, but they show how the archetype of Gog and Magog is applied to current events in the eyes of believers anticipating an end-times scenario. Outside of religious contexts, Gog and Magog occasionally appear in pop culture and literature as symbols of looming catastrophe or ancient mystery. They've been referenced in everything from novels to video games. Often the usage is more metaphorical, e.g., naming a doomsday device or a pair of monstrous characters, Gog and Magog, to evoke end-of-the-world vibes. The terms thus entered the broader cultural lexicon as shorthand for any two great evil forces or giants. Finally, it's worth noting that not all modern engagement with Gog and Magog is fearful or conspiratorial. In some cases, scholars and interfaith groups have tried to demythologize the concept. For instance, some progressive religious thinkers may interpret Gog and Magog allegorically as representing the internal evils of humanity, like greed and hatred, that will be overcome in a messianic age, rather than literal nations. There are also academic studies exploring how the legend of Gog and Magog evolved, treating it as a fascinating case of myth-making and cultural exchange, rather than a literal prophecy timeline. Still, the legacy of seeing Gog and Magog as literal agents in world affairs is very much alive. The enduring tendency to pin the label Gog and Magog on one's enemies can have real consequences. After all, if someone believes their opponent is a prophesied tool of Satan, it certainly raises the stakes of any conflict. We saw this in the Bush-Chirac episode and in other rhetoric. It serves as a reminder of how ancient apocalyptic imagery can ripple into modern geopolitics. From the dusty scrolls of Ezekiel's vision to the digital forums of today's conspiracy theorists, Gog and Magog have traveled a long and winding road through human culture. What began as a cryptic prophetic warning against an invader of Israel grew into a sprawling tapestry of myths and interpretations spanning religions and continents. To the Jews of antiquity, Gog and Magog embodied the dread of foreign conquest and the hope of divine salvation. To Christians, they became fixtures in the grand drama of the end times, symbols of demonic forces to be vanquished in the final victory of God. In Islam, they serve as a sign of the approaching day of judgment, a trial so great that even the prophets will seek refuge from their onslaught. Historically, Gog and Magog have been a mirror for humanity's fears. Whether the terror was the Huns at the gate of Rome, the Mongols sweeping across Asia, or the anxiety of a modern world war, people saw their worst enemies in these ancient names. At the same time, Gog and Magog also became figures of folklore and whimsy, giants felled by folk heroes, caricatures in festivals, showing our to tame and reinterpret fears over time. They illustrate the human penchant to link the unknown with the known. Unfamiliar peoples and places were woven into familiar prophetic frameworks, making a chaotic world feel a bit more scripted. In many ways, the tale of Gog and Magog is a testament to the power of narrative. These names, only briefly mentioned in scriptures, sparked countless stories, legends, and analyses. Emperors and caliphs sent expeditions in their name. Scholars filled pages debating their identity. Mapmakers drew them into our geography. Preachers thundered about them from pulpits. And even in the present day, they can influence public discourse or fuel wild theories. It's a prime example of how myth and reality intertwine across history. Educationally, studying Gog and Magog offers insight into how different cultures view the other and the end of the world. The enduring fascination with them indicates that the questions they raise are universal. Will there be an ultimate battle between good and evil? Who are our greatest enemies, out in the world or within ourselves? Gog and Magog in all their transformations personify those ultimate enemies, sometimes human, sometimes monstrous, sometimes allegorical, and their final defeat, in whatever form, symbolizes the triumph of order over chaos, of God's plan over human terror. In closing, Gog and Magog have transcended their origins to become a global myth of caution and expectation. They remind us how interconnected religion, history, and legend can be. Whether one views them as literal future invaders, metaphors for societal ills, or simply as enduring characters in humanity's story repertoire, Gog and Magog challenge us to interpret the world's trials in light of something bigger. As long as people envision an end to the current age, for better or worse, it seems Gog and Magog will be somewhere in the crowd, lurking as both threat and lesson. And when the final chapter of our collective story is written, we may yet hear those ancient names invoked one last time, signaling that the end, or perhaps a new beginning, is at hand. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more fascinating stories, and ring the bell so you never miss a new episode from Cipher History. Stay curious.